So say you're working at a mixed martial arts gym. Fiona's a fighter who's really disciplined. She works hard and she's been on a 5-0 winning streak, but doesn't have any ambitions to go professional. She's been on a low-fat, high-carb diet since she started martial arts at about 13, but has been reading about different diets more recently and tells her coach that she's going to go keto or ketogenic diet. She takes her supplements at the same time every day and hasn't touched a carb in weeks. She says she's getting a lot of benefits from going keto and she's not hungry at all. She's stopped binging on carbs and is finding it much easier to make weight for competitions. Her coach is relieved, says that he thought she needed a change. And what would you say to her and the coach?
Some coaches and athletes think that rigid adherence to a diet is a sign of self-discipline, that athletes need to strictly control their intake to maintain optimal performance. Others think that mental toughness means sticking to your goals no matter the cost. So what does the research say about athletes sticking to diets? A review of research in sport found that strict dieting is not likely to be an asset to athletes. Instead, it is more likely to be a red flag for an eating disorder. In female athletes like Fiona, the prevalence of disordered eating is estimated to be as high as 45%. Disordered eating isn't restricted to female athletes, with up to 20% of male athletes showing symptoms. On one hand, there is such a thing as healthy dieting, and I think it's important to be clear that being on a diet does not necessarily cause eating disorders. On the other hand, healthy dieting is at the start of a continuum of more disordered eating behaviours, moving from restrictive diets to chronic dieting to fasting and compensatory behaviours like misusing laxatives and diuretics, vomiting, and excessive exercise. At this unhealthy end of the continuum are diagnosable eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and other feeding or eating disorders. Disordered eating is more common for athletes in aesthetic sports like dancing and gymnastics, where there's a certain body shape that is seen as desirable. It's also common in weight class sports like boxing and horse racing, where athletes can go to extreme lengths to meet their desired weight. Having said that, disordered eating and body dissatisfaction are pervasive amongst people both in and out of sport. One study of women in the general population found that over 40% had an eating disorder at some point in their life.
So regardless of whether Fiona's an athlete or not, there's a risk that Fiona's dieting could be a sign of a problem. But if we stop Fiona from dieting and get her to eat normally, will that stop her from developing an eating disorder?
It's common to think that diets start this slippery slope toward disordered eating, and a meta-analysis of risk factors helps shed some light on the problem. It's true that self-reported dieting predicts negative outcomes like bulimia, disordered eating, and negative affect in longitudinal studies. But as discussed elsewhere, diets given in experimental conditions often lead to better psychological outcomes. So what's going on?
Maybe diets help overweight people enrolled in these studies, but hurt people in the general population who are normal weight?
The problem here is that there was no relationship between the weights of the people on diets and the effect those diets had on their psychology. It wasn't that heavier people were happier after diets, but lighter people were less happy. The correlation was almost zero, so that the data doesn't support that idea.
What if diets help for a little while, but then people eventually break the diet and start binge eating?
As discussed elsewhere, there's no evidence of this either, and people placed on diets can actually reduce their binge eating if they had a problem with it before. The meta-analyses on these topics suggest another explanation for the relationship between dieting and eating pathology. Dieting does not appear to cause eating disorders, but instead, diets appear to be a symptom of other pathologies that cause eating disorders. For example, if someone was perfectionistic, unhappy, or prone to binge eating, then they would be more likely to start a diet. And they would also be more likely to develop an eating disorder.
So for Fiona, going on a diet isn't likely to cause an eating disorder, but instead the diet could be a symptom of a more serious problem. How would you know if it was problematic? And if it was, what would you do?
There are a few questions that might help figure out how Fiona is going with her body and her eating, drawn from a meta-analysis of risk factors for eating disorder pathology. Does she feel pressure to be thinner from her coach and the people around her? Those who feel pressure to be thin from society or from friends and family are much more likely to develop all kinds of eating disorder symptoms. What does she see as an ideal body? People who aim to be thin as opposed to aiming for fitness and health tend to be less happy about themselves, their body and their lives more generally. These factors cause and maintain binge eating, disorders like bulimia and other eating disorder symptoms. How does she see herself? If she's unhappy with her body, she's more likely to have all the problems we've described so far. How is her mood tracking? People who are unhappy or have what's called a negative affect can get stuck in a cycle of binging, compensating, and restricting. For this reason, mood is an important factor to consider when looking out for problematic eating. Finally, how does she go when she slips off her diet or her training plan? People who are perfectionistic or rigid in their behaviour are more likely to get stuck in the cycle of an eating disorder. On the other hand, if she's forgiving of herself for making a mistake and allows herself flexibility in her diet and exercise, perhaps it's more likely that she's at the healthier end of the spectrum. If you ask all of these questions and she's answering with a few red flags, then psychological support can help her become happier about herself and her body without compromising her performance. Sports psychologists often help athletes manage weight and shape concerns and learn how to do it while making performance better, not worse. Otherwise, the evidence for treating most eating disorders, like binge eating disorder and bulimia, is very strong. Well-trained psychologists and some general practitioners can provide specific psychological strategies like cognitive behaviour therapy to help people overcome these weight and shape concerns.
So while Fiona's dieting is unlikely to cause her to slip into an eating disorder, it's possible that the dieting is a symptom of some psychological problems that do have solutions. As always, it's good for Fiona's physical health to be monitored by a doctor and an accredited dietitian. But for her psychological health, if she's showing signs of perfectionism, rigidity, dissatisfaction, or low mood, consider having a conversation about whether she'd like some help to be happier about herself and her body. Remember that Fiona has been dieting since she was 13. She's quite rigidly sticking to this diet and also to her supplement regime. It's also interesting to note that there seems to be a bit of social pressure from her coach to lose weight because he was so relieved when she changed her diet. If you ask her these sorts of questions and you are picking up a number of red flags, then looking at something like cognitive behaviour therapy as a treatment is likely to really help her well-being without having a negative influence on her performance.